zone. So that's also why it says do not pass. So if you want to leave before this panel is over, you will have to embarrass yourself by walking, and we will know who you are. But as soon as we're done, you will be allowed to run out to the reception. So those were all my boring logistical announcements. Can someone help me close the doors so that it becomes a bit more quiet in here? All right. Formally, hello, my name is Tove Riding. And I am one of the 4 policy and advocacy managers at Eurodad. I work on tax justice. And I will be chairing a very fun panel because this is the point in time where we will start to think big. And why do we need to do that? Well, was I the only one who noticed at the previous panel when the minister was talking how he explained very clearly that he was against an intergovernmental body on tax under the auspices of the United Nations? Of course, we all feel a bit sad hearing that. And then about 5 minutes later, he says something along the lines of, I'm not against in principle. And then he even adds, but I doubt that this is a really big issue. So I had an emotional journey from depression to joy, and then into this slight doubt about whether our ambitions are really ambitions. Are we really ambitious enough when the minister says, I doubt this can even be a problem? So this is the start of our thinking about the world that we want to see. And this is the point where we pull out not what we think the ministers would agree to if no one pressured them, but what needs to happen in the outer world. And as you can say it, when you talk to ministers, you often hear about this political reality that you need to respect. If you ask closer into it, you will notice that it is the current political position of this particular minister in his particular country. Now, we did not come all the way to Denmark just to analyze the current political realities. We definitely didn't come here to respect the political realities. We came here to challenge the political realities, and we came here ultimately to get a plan for how to change the political realities. And since we're in Denmark, there is a political saying in Denmark about ministers. Ministers have a political position until they take another political position. It's a very famous saying, actually quoting a minister. So our job now is to think big. So please start thinking about what you think needs to happen in Addis Ababa and about how we get there. And then to stimulate your thinking, you will notice that we have a very, very distinguished panel of speakers to get you started. But I also promise there will be more time for questions and comments from the audience from this panel than from the previous one. So first to kick us off is Romilly Greenhill, currently from ODI, but also previously from DFID and even from ActionAid. So I think we can say that Romilly brings a broad experience to this panel, and she's going to pick up on the challenge of how we can become the first generation to end poverty. So thank you very much, Romilly, for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really thrilled to be here. And I'm feeling rather old because I just realised the first ever Eurodad conference I went to was in 2001, which was in Switzerland, and everybody was very excited about fair and transparent arbitration processes for debt workout mechanisms, which is unfortunately something we're still talking about 14 years later, but it's absolutely fantastic to be back at a Eurodad conference. And just one small anecdote on the point about sort of politicians changing their positions. I was in DFID, as Tove mentioned, and I was in DFID at the time of the Accra High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness. And I very distinctly heard the minister at the time, Douglas Alexander, in Accra say, I met with the UK Aid Network NGOs yesterday. I told them I was going to go to Accra to push for an ambitious outcome. He actually arrived in Accra to be told that the negotiations had closed and there was nothing more for him to push for. and it wasn't very ambitious. And he actually reopened the negotiations at that point. And one of the reasons very distinctly was the meeting he had with the UK NGOs the previous day. So, I mean, everything is possible. On that note, I'm going to talk about the unambitious goal of how do we be the first generation to end poverty. As somebody said earlier, I think it's a really good way of framing the discussion. So my presentation very much is focused on how do we finance Goal 1, and particularly some elements of SDG Goal 1, which is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. I am a bit more focused on aid than some of the discussion earlier. That's not to say that other issues are not important, but I wanted to look at one part of the picture. And the research I'm going to present is very much drawn from this publication, of which there are some copies outside, called Financing the Future. And there's the executive summary is in orange. So if you want to know more, please do pick up a copy. So without further ado, can I have the first slide, please? So I think all of us know this, but there has been massive progress over the last 15, 20 years or so on reducing extreme poverty. The overall line is the number of people living below the extreme poverty line, and then there's a regional breakdown. I don't know how well you can see this, but the thing that I wanted to highlight is if you look at the bottom, which is the orange, yellowy orange line, that is the sub-Saharan Africa line. So essentially what this chart is showing you is that we've seen very rapid reductions in poverty, but actually not in sub-Saharan Africa. We're actually seeing an increase in absolute numbers of people living in poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, a lot of people, next slide please, have done a lot of projections on what is going to happen to the poverty trends between now and 2030. And I think there's a kind of a good news message here and a bad news message here. The good news is, if you put the most optimistic scenarios about growth and inequality into your models, you can get fairly close to zero extreme poverty. It's not impossible. You can get to a kind of 3% type of level of poverty by 2030. If, however, you have less optimistic scenarios on growth and inequality, actually, you can't see it very clearly from these two slides, but actually you could end up with a flat poverty line. So a no reduction in the proportion of people living below the poverty line by 2030. So it's really critical what happens to growth, how inclusive that growth is, and what happens to inequality over the next 15 years is absolutely critical to how we are going to get to eradicating poverty. None of these scenarios, by the way, factor in climate change. Climate change obviously is another additional risk that's likely to push more people into poverty over the next 15 years. So the headline message there is really, it's achievable, but we need to see the right kind of growth, and we definitely need to see action on inequality. Next slide, please. The other issue, as with the trends we've seen so far, is that we are going to see, most of the projections suggest, a much, much greater concentration of people living in poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and also in fragile states, which you can't see on this chart. But what this chart shows, again, the yellow bar is sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at the distribution of poverty in 2011, roughly equal in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. If you look at what's likely to happen by 2030, it is almost all going to be about people living in sub-Saharan Africa, people in poverty. The other point is around fragile and conflict-affected states. There's different projections on this, but the projections tend to agree that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of poor people will be living in fragile states by 2030. So whatever Addis delivers, it's got to work. If it's going to really tackle extreme poverty, it's got to work for people living in fragile and conflict-affected states. Next slide, please. So there are obviously many things that you can do to eradicate extreme poverty, and some colleagues at ODI and in other organisations through the Chronic Poverty Assessment Network, Advisory Network, sorry, have looked into this in some detail. I'm going to just really focus on three here, which are social protection, free basic universal health care through universal health coverage, and free primary and secondary education for all. And I was actually very interested that the UNDP speaker in the last session was saying that these were elements of countries that had made rapid progress over the past 2 decades or so. Now, this is obviously only part of the picture, but on the social sectors, these are the things that we absolutely need to do to both tackle poverty, to lift people above the poverty line, but also critically to stop people falling back into poverty. That's one of the critical things with health. People can escape poverty, they have a catastrophic health event, and then they push back into poverty. The other thing I really, really want to emphasize here is that the evidence on balance shows that these things really need public money. Now, one of my biggest bugbears in the SDG financing debates is people saying, we need $1.5 trillion of money, we don't have enough ODA, therefore we need the private sector to fill the gap. I think for me that's misleading in two ways. One, because I think you need to look specifically at which sectors you're talking about in order to know what kind of money you need. So if you're talking about renewable energy generation, you're not expecting the public sector to do all of that. You probably need the private sector, you need to have the right incentives and so on. If you're talking about universal health coverage, social protection and education, generally it's public money you need. And there's been a whole debate on user fees and all the rest of it, private provision of healthcare. But this is really where the evidence comes down, that it's about public finance, not necessarily public provision, but definitely public finance. So that's the kind of real thing that I wanted to emphasize. So when you're thinking about public finance, you then have to start thinking, how much of this can countries fund themselves, and then how much needs to come from the international community. And this is where we have done a bit of country-by-country analysis. Next slide, please. And all of this is in the paper if people want to know more about the methodology. But what we essentially did is to look for a group of 89 countries, which is all the countries above 1 million population and a 1% poverty rate, and to look at what are the per capita costs of health, universal health coverage, basic quality primary and secondary education, and cash transfers, which is our sort of proxy here for wider social protection. How much is it going to cost per country? What is the feasible tax revenue that countries have under the sort of current conditions? And this is based on IMF and World Bank assessments of potential tax revenue in the country, and then existing levels of aid. And we then mapped these things together to say, okay, how much could countries actually fund themselves? And what I've only shown on this chart, the low income countries, because if I did all countries, it'd be very difficult to read. But the headline is that the really, really, really big financing gap is in the least developed countries and the fragile states. There's a lot of overlap between those categories. Actually, most middle-income countries turn out to be able to do this themselves for these sectors. Possibly not for others, but for these sectors, they can fund it themselves. And interestingly enough, the cutoff comes at roughly some lower middle-income countries that still can't do it, but the cutoff is round about the kind of lick-mick split. And you can see the really big gap, which is the gap between the yellow line and the green bars, comes in the really, really, very, very poorest countries. So we add up all the costs. Adding it up per capita per country, we work out that what we need is about 148 billion, what we have is 75 billion, and the shortfall is 73 billion. Now, of course, there's huge assumptions that one has to make. These figures are very imprecise, but that gives us a kind of rough order of the scale of magnitude. So that gap, and I know financing gap discussions are very unfashionable, nobody likes to talk about it, but I think it's a really important thing to talk about. You know, we need to fill this gap either through aid or through taking radical steps on tax, improving tax capacity, illicit flows and all that. And in reality, we probably need to do both of those things simultaneously to raise that kind of level of resources. So particularly focusing on the aid side, because others are much more expert than me on the tax side, we've got 5 main recommendations for what all of this means for Addis. The first one, we've talked about this already, and it's obvious, but nevertheless worth emphasizing, is really recommit to the 0.7% target. Actually, if all OECD countries committed to that target, we would have more than enough money to fill the financing gap that we were talking about. The second, and I know this is controversial in some quarters, but is really about how do we bring emerging economies into the development financing system as contributors. The third, which also came up in the last session, is about being much more ambitious about how much of aid goes to the least developed countries. We think it should be at least 50% as a starting point, possibly more. The fourth is that we do need to think about aid effectiveness and aid quality. And this is, again, particularly important because of the fragile states issue and the fact that poverty will be very much concentrated in fragile states. We also, realistically, we need to look at what the evidence of the Paris and Accra and so on aid effectiveness agendas, what worked and what worked less well over the last 10 years since the Paris Declaration. And so the headline recommendations we are talking about is more flexible aid. We need much more kind of adaptive and iterative, flexible ways of providing aid. It needs to be much longer term. We need to be able to make longer term investments. There needs to be more risk sharing. Realistically, if you're going to spend money in fragile states, you can't expect 100% of projects to succeed. It's just not going to happen. And you also need to be faster with how you to provide aid. The Paris agenda is still incredibly important, by the way, but these are the new things that need to be added. And then the last big recommendation we have is to really think about a new multilateralism. We have, as we know, many bilateral donors, huge problems continuing with coordination, with countries not working well together, with alignment, all the rest of it. And we think that one of the ways that you can really tackle that is through greater use of multilaterals. So we're saying where you don't have multilaterals, for example, in social protection, there's no multilateral financing mechanism. We think there should be one. We should expand the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria to be a wider universal health coverage global fund. We need new mechanisms for humanitarian education in humanitarian emergencies, but more widely, we need to think much more multilaterally, and we think that should be a big commitment for Addis. So that's a whiz through some ideas, but very happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Romilly, for this presentation. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions later on. Good, and now to the next speaker. I'm not sure Martin Koh needs an introduction, but I'll give it anyway. So Martin is, of course, the director of the South Center. And we just had a very quick reflection before we started. Many of us live in this European Union, and we're used to all these European member states, and 28 is a lot of countries. But actually, the South Center has many more member states than the European Union, above 50. Also, OECD is nowhere near this number. So this is the intergovernmental body that Martin is director of, that does both research and arranges meetings for these governments, as well as for a number of other governments who are not members. Before the South Center, Martin was director of another very dear organization to us. Warm welcome, Bhumika, the Third World Network. A constant source of not only information, but also inspiration. So, yeah, and I think it's, if someone would ask me, who do you think has the most experience on the multilateral processes? I think Martin Koh might actually be a good guess. So we're very happy to have you here, Martin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I want to thank Eurodad for bringing us all here for this meeting. I think this gathering, we have so many people here. We are going to discuss so many issues. Shows the emergence of Eurodad as a major force in the area of finance. Am I right? I don't know that
Absolutely.
much about what's been happening. And they seem to have attracted people coming from, I think, two of you were in Greenpeace, huh? In climate change. So to drag someone from Greenpeace dealing with, in charge of climate policy in a year where they're going to make key decisions, and pull them into Eurodad, or she pulled herself, I don't know.
I came voluntarily.
Yeah. So she probably thinks that the development crisis is as big or bigger than the climate crisis, or the two are related. And I'm sure the same for your other colleagues. So more power, we need to get together, we need to coordinate better on finance issues. And this is one area where we really need to get our act together better. And when we do, I think we can really make a difference. I don't have a PowerPoint, sorry. Oh, it's good, so you have to listen to me. I have put 3 papers on the table from the South Center. One is on the investment agreements. You know, this is a huge area that we now have to fight. Another one is called the South Center statement at the G24 meeting. You know, the G24 is the coordinator of developing countries in the IMF and World Bank. But what's interesting is the annex of that statement. It's only 2 pages, but there's an annex on the debt restructuring mechanism. And there's another one on why developing countries have got themselves into a fix by becoming newly vulnerable in new ways to a financial crisis that we never expected. So look at that. And finally, there is the South Bulletin, the special issue on vulture funds. So I'll be speaking on some of these issues. I have another paper, actually, it's a secret paper on what's wrong with the zero draft of FFD, for those of you who are specialists in the FFD, and what's good in it and how it should be changed. Okay, so this is, there's no more space on that table. So those of you who really want this on our analysis of the FFD, which we presented to the developing countries in New York as an input for them in the negotiations. So we have been asked, what are the key issues and what are the key actions we need to do? This is supposed to be the big picture. Huh? We are supposed to do it in 7 minutes. So we'll try. Global finance and global economy is in a crisis. We've been saying that for years, but this is a crisis that is brewing and is about to explode in a bigger way than 3 or 4 years ago. Number one, we have a financial system that is unequal. There's a democratic deficit. The South has very little say. The international financial institutions have not reformed. We thought they were going to reform, and even if they were reformed, it would have been in a very marginal way in terms of quotas, but even that marginal thing could not be done. You can blame it on the US Congress or whatever it is, but the developing countries have lost hope that anything infinitesimal can even be done. So they've set up their own institutions. Secondly, it's unstable. System is unstable, fluctuations in exchange rates, capital flows, employment. Thirdly, it is weird. It's a weird system.
It's weird.
Usually, if you're a dog, you wag your tail. But now you're a tail and you wag the dog. This is what's happened. Finance does not serve the real economy. The real economy serves finance. It's very weird. I mean, go home and look at your dog. If you find that its tail is wagging the whole dog, moving round and round, it's weird. And that's what we have. But it's also dangerous because it's not only finance wagging the dog, it's speculative finance wagging finance to wag the dog. So we have a speculative system where you have rental, you have people who gamble, who are thieves, and they reap a lot of benefit of that system, but then also renders the poor dog twirling around in a mad and crazy way. I mean, if you steal and you're a thief and you steal, that's bad enough. But if you're a thief and you steal and you make the whole family twirl round and round when you steal for years and years, it's even worse. Then it is anti-developmental, subjects developing countries to the volatility and vulnerability to debt and to structural adjustment type of policies when they fall into debt. So these are 5 things. You are very familiar with this, but I just thought of putting it concisely. It is said that the world has changed, the South has risen, the poor North is now very poor, they only grow at 1%, the South is growing at 10%. So we don't have to worry about the developing countries anymore, except those in conflict and a few LDCs and so on. But this is not true. This so-called convergence where developing countries were growing much faster began to take place only in 2000 and was taking place for about a decade. But it has stopped taking place. And in that decade, from 2000 to maybe 2011, we had a combination of factors which are no longer there. The US having trade deficits, huge debt in the developed countries, fueling growth in the North that became a locomotive. Countries like China, India, and so on that were growing very fast and also pulling other countries along, particularly affecting Africa and Latin America through the commodity sector. Have you heard of the super cycle? It is like we've broken the commodity problem because instead of commodities having booms and busts, it is always booming. And the prices are always very high, and we have licked the problem of commodity dependence. Well, that is not true anymore. Commodities are behaving like they used to be, and they are now declining. And those countries that are dependent on commodities are now falling together with them. The BRICS countries were supposed to show how emerging economies are going to burst into the world economy. The OECD said the rise of the South. But the same people who coined the term BRICS and other economies that are supposed to be growing now came up with the fragile five. Those 5 emerging economies that are vulnerable to collapse. And they happen to be the same economies, except China. China is really strong. So many emerging economies that actually grew fast may not be growing sustainably. They were still commodity dependent. They had trade deficits. And when the situation changes, because the US and Europe are no longer the locomotives, then the developing countries are hit. Now we have the QE problem. You are finance experts. We are supposed to be. So the QE and easy money came in because they couldn't do fiscal pumping due to Congress, Parliament, and so on. And that flooded the world with trillions of dollars, supposed to kickstart small businesses into production, but it did not. Much of the QE money went into speculation in the commodity markets and in the stock markets. And now the US does not know how to reverse the QE. I mean, it's come to a stop, but to reverse it is a problem. And at the moment when the US can't even get itself to reverse QE, Europe is entering QE. So there's another liquidity, burst into the world. Now, when QE takes place, developing countries are affected. So much money is coming in. The currencies are rising. There is inflation, and developing countries are grumbling. But when QE is reversed, you have the reverse problem. Okay, that is, currencies are going down, and the economies are facing recession, and then you have a massive outflow of funds. So in this, you have a problem. In that, you have a problem. In other words, excessive capital flows, especially for speculative reasons, causes massive tsunami problems in developing countries. So what are the key issues we have that we need to act on? Number one, the increasing financialization of the economy in the developing countries. The developed countries, we already know they have financialized, but in the developing countries, increasing their vulnerabilities, including in new ways. We have a new paper in the South Center on our website on financialization and the new vulnerabilities and risks facing developing countries, different categories of developing countries. Action that we need, how to scale down and stop this trend of financialization. How to reverse the thinking that if you financialize in so many different ways, you are modernizing and doing good for your economy. How to point out the risks and the problems. This is the action that we need to take. Second, a new global financial crisis is coming. We are seeing it on the horizon. QE and cheap credit is a stopgap measure, but it's coming to an end, maybe sometime now in Europe. It didn't solve the problem. We are now going to face a new crisis as the US interest rates will go up, as there's a reversal of capital flows, as countries that have a current account deficit or are overly dependent on debt, including debt in domestic currency. It was thought that if you have debt in domestic currency, that's not a problem, because if you have debt in US dollar, it could be a problem if there's a fluctuation in exchange rate. But some countries, developing countries, are now so overly dependent on their government debt or even private sector debt denominated in local currency that can flow out at any time because of a sale in the secondary market and pulling out. So the action we need to take, how do we anticipate for different categories of countries, how they are vulnerable in different ways, what actions they can take to anticipate the crisis that is coming, or when the crisis comes, what measures can we offer to mitigate the crisis that is coming. Third problem, the shocks in the trading system that has a financial impact. Most importantly, the commodity price and demand crunch that is now taking place. Reduced tourism, reduction of workers' remittance home, which is a very important source of financing for developing countries. Action needed. How do we anticipate? Some of these shocks are already coming, but it's going to get worse. How do we deal with it? How do we increase external financing to developing countries that require it? What are the mechanisms by which this external financing can be given to the developing countries without overburdening them with new debt or new conditionality? You see, I have a lot of actions, but in the form of questions. You have to answer the question. There are many, many workshops. Fourthly, a new debt crisis is looming. Some countries have already fallen into debt. The Caribbean countries, some African countries have gone to the IMF. But this is only the beginning. I see some papers on the table on the new debt crisis that is coming. What do we do when countries fall again into debt, developing countries? At the moment, we don't have an international system. The only thing they can do is go to the IMF or other countries, do structural adjustment. For 20 years, the debt crisis will grow and grow, even for countries that have done, especially those who have done structural adjustment. Just look at Greece. And after 20 years, maybe we have a new HIPC for them. But after 20 years, these countries are squeezed dry, and they have really, you are now dealing with cops. We don't want people to die. So these countries, some of them do unilateral debt workout if they are very brave. But then they face a problem that they are shunned by the international community. These are pariahs. These are countries that are very bad. Actually, they just have to do an emergency. But then when they do an emergency, when they face one, then measures, they are considered to be horrible. Secondly, even if they succeed, the voucher fund will come in and make them fail. So this is the lesson we have seen in Argentina, but many other countries. There are many, many African countries and LDCs that have faced the problem of voucher funds. So the action that is needed, we have to deal with these voucher funds and make them illegal through national legislation, even if we can't do it through international regulation. And most important of all, we need an international debt restructuring mechanism. And this is what the NGOs have been advocating for a long time. Jubilee has been in the forefront, even in those days when the IMF took it up but failed. Of course, the United Nations through UNCTAD have been the champions of this for many decades. And suddenly, due to the voucher fund decision in the US, Argentina took it up. The G7 backed up Argentina. And today, hey presto, we have an ad hoc committee in the United Nations that is dealing with the establishment of a legally binding international debt restructuring mechanism. That's a very good news. The bad news is that the developed countries don't like the UN to be a venue for this kind of thing. Maybe they don't like anybody to be a venue for this debt restructuring mechanism. So they have boycotted the ad hoc committee that is dealing with it. That's the bad news. The good news is that they have boycotted. It's outrageous. You are the NGOs, you are the activists. An activist is one who changes the political reality, not only that does not accept it, but changes it. So that's the good news. There's something for you to do that is going to be very, very important. We don't want another generation of countries that are going to undergo 20 years of structural adjustment, and then we know that the country really cannot pay, they are really dead, and then we give them a HIPC. And it takes another 20 years for the HIPC and recover the evolution upfront and not after 20 years. And the debt restructuring mechanism is the solution. So we need to learn up the technical details. We need to engage in this ad hoc committee. We need to set it up in the United Nations, and we have to change our government's positions, those governments that are against it, because the public opinion is so strong that the minister will change his position, right? What we have said just now. The fifth is the investment agreements. the investment agreements will make it impossible for economic policy, health policy, environmental policy, etc., because they have been designed in such a way to give all the advantages to the foreign investor that can sue you in an international tribunal, usually under the World Bank, with a definition of fair and equitable treatment and expropriation that is so unbelievable that if a company were to set up in your country and your government happens to introduce a new policy or change the policy, including for climate change, right now we're going to Paris, we're going to pledge to do all these things for mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage. And if you actually implement the pledge, you will be sued for trillions of dollars by these companies. Germany has already been sued for trying to withdraw nuclear power, but also for tightening emission control in power plants. They have been sued by a foreign company to the tune of billions of dollars. And this is why Germany is now rethinking the value of these investment treaties. But all the wonderful things we are talking about, debt restructuring, capital controls, climate change policy, health regulations, etc., cannot be implemented unless we get rid of these investment agreements. It's quite impossible to reform it. The whole system is riddled with conflict of interest, corruption, etc., which if many of you are fighting on this issue, and this is really an affront on us. The fact that such investment agreements exist and continue to exist is an insult to the public, and it's a challenge to the NGO community. The fact that it exists means that we cannot sleep. 6, we need to facilitate new financing to those developing countries that need it. We have heard the story of ODA. I'm very happy that this was done, that you also said that public financing is needed for certain things, particularly in the social sector. If a company wants to make profit, don't give him grant, give him a loan. He has to pay it back. But for social protection, we really need social funding. For environmental protection, for climate change, you need public funding. Otherwise, we will be in such a situation where we take on the SDGs, and if we take it seriously, these are new obligations that developing countries will have to take on, new international obligations. And we are talking of universal health coverage. We are talking of free education. We are talking of water supply for those who need it. And actually, this is quite ironic. In a period when Europe, that champions social protection, is withdrawing social protection, ask your friends in Greece or Spain what I'm talking about, right? And at the same time, we are asking developing countries to take on what Europe is now withdrawing from, or the US is withdrawing from. Poor Obama, he tried to introduce a little bit of, care for health, not even up to European standards, and he's bombarded by his Congress. So if I were a developing country government, I would be very skeptical. Why are you asking me to take on social protection as a human right and as an international obligation, not only in the Human Rights Council, but now in the General Assembly of the UN, when you yourself are not able to do it? But for better or for worse, our developing country governments have internalized social protection, and they have pledged it. Some countries have put it not only as a basic need, but as a human right, and some have put it in the constitution as a constitutional right. But how are they going to fulfill it? Where's the financing coming from? Hepatitis C, the new cure, costs $100,000 in the developed countries. These same companies are coming to some developing countries and say, well, we'll give you a discount. How about $30,000? Who can afford $30,000 to have the new cure for hepatitis C? That is why the National Health Service in the UK cannot afford to take on hepatitis C new medicine, and in other European countries as well. They cannot have universal health care for hepatitis C, where there is a 95% chance of success if you take that medicine, because the company is reaping monopoly profits. So we have to face up to the financing of the SDGs, especially those that refer to basic needs. And we have done calculations that we need an extra $75 billion. This is probably an underestimate because if you include cancer drugs, hepatitis C drugs.
This is for basic. That was for the basic
yeah.
level for universal health
coverage.
So
we need to face up, for example, in healthcare. It's a crime that companies are reaping monopoly profits out of people's lives. Yes, they have to recover their costs. Yes, they have to recover their innovation costs. If we know what these costs are, but don't charge such excessive profits that millions of people are unnecessarily dying. So ODA has to increase. The SDRs were issued. New issue of SDRs were done in 2000, I think it was 7 or 8 under Gordon Brown. But under IMF rules, it can be issued only according to your quota. You can only get the SDRs according to your quota. We need to have issue of SDRs according to needs. So the developing countries that require it for development purposes should be able to draw on SDR as new source of external financing. This is actually in the zero draft of the FFD. In a very vague way, it is going to be opposed by developed countries. This is a major thing that we have to fight for. If the FFD actually says that we can issue SDRs on the basis of need, especially to developing countries, it would already be worth having this FFD conference. And then, of course, increase in developed countries of revenue through financial transaction tax, tax on luxuries, tax on environment, and channel these taxes not only to domestic causes that are worthwhile, but also to international causes such as eradication of poverty, the fight against climate change, and the fulfillment of SDGs. Okay, so this is something in which you, the NGOs, are in the forefront of, and you can make a lot of progress there. The 7th point is that the SDGs are an opportunity. Previously in the FFDs, we did say that if countries were to fulfill their MDGs, this should be taken into account when we calculate debt sustainability. I think in the pre-zero draft, this was very clearly stated. According to my sources, the IMF and some developed countries objected. So now it is very weak. If we are able to fight and succeed to say something very simple like developing countries need to fulfill their obligations on SDGs, and the financing that they need in order to fulfill their SDGs should be fully taken into account in the calculation of debt sustainability. In other words, when we say a country has to pay its debt, a country also has to fulfill its SDGs. So the SDGs is a higher priority than paying of debt. And therefore, if there is limited funds of the country, that country cannot pay its debt in full because it has to fulfill its SDGs. So this is the meaning of taking into account the fulfillment of SDGs in the calculation of debt sustainability. Now, if we do get that language, and if it is operationalized, then FFD3 would really be worthwhile. The 8th point, we have to avoid bad things that the FFD may champion and then create a new trend. The worst thing is to give a big boost to private financing and the private sector. Now, I don't think we are against private financing or the private sector. We don't have any ideological, thing against it. But if, because some governments are unable to live up to their ODA, and then they don't want to say, I can't do my ODA anymore, and then they say, well, look to the private sector or look to China as an excuse, and then the way in which we pass on the responsibility to the private sector could be, if we do it wrongly, and I think they're going to do it wrongly, for example, to give subsidy to the private sector, to give loan guarantee to the private sector, to do co-equity with the private sector, and we don't do due diligence, then we are going to increase the risks, not only of financial failure, but that we are giving the keys to the bank when we go home at night. You're a bank employee, you go home, and you give the keys to the thief. Okay? Because many problems in the world, in the financial area, were created by the private sector. So who do you give the keys to? So there is an over-romanticizing in the FFD draft that everything is going to be given to the private sector or something called public-private partnership. We are not against it, but don't think that this is going to be the solution to the world's problems or that we over-rely on it. The 9th point is that we need to help developing countries to have good financial and economic policies. We should not stop them when they have these good policies or try to have these policies. In other words, give them the policy space. Don't prevent them from having policy space. For example, if they want to do capital controls to prevent volatility and crisis, if they want to stop capital flight, if they want to recover funds from tax havens, we should not stop them. So our action is, what are the things that are stopping developing countries from doing it? Many of it has to do with the rules in WTO, in the free trade agreements, in the investment treaties. We need to review these treaties in order to free the policy space for developing countries to be able to take good actions when they require it. And finally, I know, Chair, that the 7 minutes is more than up. Just one last point, the way ahead. Because I do come from civil society, I know the power of civil society. We managed to stop the multilateral agreement on investments. Okay, that was a major achievement. We managed to put brakes on globalization in many areas. Not enough, because financial globalization went ahead. Perhaps we didn't understand it and we didn't fight enough on financial globalization, and we had a financial crisis, and we are about to have a new financial crisis. So if the NGOs were to gather more knowledge, including in areas which may seem to be too technical for us, but we become expert in them, build a capacity for advocacy, and most important of all, organize ourselves and coordinate much better in a systematic way, then this is really the solution. Because we don't trust the governments to do it, they are under too much influence of the companies. The private sector is the NGOs and the civil society and the social movements are the countervailing force. We have to get our act together. And those of you in this crowd who are funders in the foundations or in the international organizations, there's no better thing you can do than to invest in the NGO community that is serious and that can carry the battle forward. This whole issue of tax justice and so on came from the NGO community and is now catching up with the governments. 5 years ago, if you say increase your tax, they'll say nothing doing. You can't even have a tax on climate change. That's why they went into the carbon markets. It was totally a wrong step. But today, in the SDGs, in the FFD, developing countries have to increase their taxes. Can you imagine? 5 years ago, if a country wanted to increase its tax, they will say you're a communist and you should get out of this world. And today you say, please increase your tax. Maybe there's an ulterior motive. I don't want to give you aid anymore. Please increase your own taxes. But this is an NGO achievement. So let's get our act together. Let's be more sophisticated. Let us anticipate crises before they take place to prevent the crisis or to be able to mitigate before they take place. And those of you who have funds, try to give funds to the NGOs. So I end by saying, as you pointed out on political realities, the minister will say, because of political reality, I can't do it. The NGOs say, because of the political reality, there is a crisis. My job is to change the political reality. And then tomorrow the minister says, well, the political reality has changed, so now I'm taking a different position. So this is where we see the political gap and we fill it in through NGO actions that are effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I can at least assure you that I do not regret leaving climate change and a certain organization to be here instead today. It's all sides of the same battle, and I think I do very much enjoy the spirit and level of ambition and will to act here. So I hope I will not be disappointed when we get to the questions and comment section. But first, we're going to Esteban Perez. We just acknowledged that actually Esteban and I travel around the world and are on panels together. So here we are again. Esteban comes from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And he will talk about the regional consultation in Latin America that was just held on financing for development and give us some feedback from that point. So thank you very much, Esteban, for coming.
Thank you very much. Before starting, I would like to thank on my behalf and also on the behalf of the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the invitation by Eurodad to present our work and to present the key messages of the Latin America and Caribbean Regional Consultation for Financing for Development that was held on the 12th and 13th of March this year. All the regional commissions hold their regional consultation, and the idea is to bring together ideas for the region so that the region could take those ideas to Addis Ababa and put them, some of them, which in the draft. I'm going to talk about 5 key messages. The key messages are based on this document, which is called Financing for Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, a strategic analysis from a middle-income country perspective, and you have some copies outside if you want to get the full, all the messages. The first message I would like to present is the importance of domestic resources, the zero draft, and in general, this conference will place a lot of importance on the mobilization of domestic resources. And the message is that domestic resources are certainly at the core of financing for development, but you also have to give a lot of importance to the limitations some countries face in raising domestic resources. The graph you see there is the percentage of GDP, tax to GDP ratio, and you'll see that Latin America increased from 1990 to 2013 from 14% of GDP to about 21% of GDP, and it narrowed the gap with the OECD, and that's a good thing. At the same time, however, the countries from Latin America, and in particular most of the smaller countries, also are constrained by insufficient tax revenues, and as you know, tax evasion, elusion, and also illicit flows. In terms of tax evasion, we have in the region very high rates of tax evasion in terms of value-added tax ranging from 18% to 37% of tax revenue. And if you, that's for value-added tax, and if you take the income tax, the levels of evasion may exceed in some countries 60%. So you have to have the institutional capacity in order to do that. In addition, you also have the problem of illicit flows, as you will know. The last estimations by the Transparency Coalition put illicit flows that leave Latin America at 154 billion, which are above foreign direct investment, twice the amount of remittances, 60 billion, 15 times ODA, which is 10 billion. ODA represents about 0.2% of GDP or GNI for Latin American countries. If you add illicit flows and you also add repatriations for foreign direct investment, you may have the result that in some countries, instead of receiving resources, you're actually giving resources away to the rest of the world. And so you have to have a financial architecture that actually transfers funds to developing economies and not takes away funds from developing countries, because that would be fairly perverse. The second message that I would like to say is that to tackle these issues of tax evasion, illicit flows, not only must the burden be placed on economies themselves, domestic economies, but also you need multilateral cooperation. And multilateral cooperation actually is an urgent task, especially at the tax level of the international community. The third message that I would like to share is that multilateral cooperation is also needed in Latin America and the Caribbean to reduce debt. Latin America has managed to reduce debt, but that's not the situation of the small island developing states, the vulnerable economies of the Caribbean, which have had high rates of high stocks of debt to high ratios of debt to GDP ratios at least for 10 years. And some of them have ratios, I'm thinking about Jamaica, about 141% of GDP. And what happens when you have ratios like that, besides the fact that you get high risk premium, currency instability, and so on, the most important factor, this is from my own personal point of view, is that it withdraws resources from the state and from the government, because the government, instead of being worried and occupied with education, with health, the government is worried about administering the debt. And sometimes the resources to administer and pay the debt represent about 75% of the expenditures of the government. And so it's very difficult for a government that has those high levels of debt be a pro-development type of government. So you need a multilateral cooperation. The third point that I would like to make is that although we talk a lot about tax resources, we tend to equate, sometimes implicitly, other times explicitly, domestic resources with tax resources, and domestic resource mobilization with tax mobilization of resources. And I think we should not equate domestic resources with fiscal resources, and we have to bring other types of agents in order to channel and mobilize resources in developing economies. And I'm thinking here of sub-regional and national development banks. In Latin America, we have three big regional banks: the Caribbean Development Banks, Latin America Development Banks that belongs to the Andean region, and the Central American Economic Integration Bank. And these banks mobilize, the three of them, more resources and lend more resources to Latin America than some of the big multilateral banks in some years, like the World Bank or the IDB. And at the national level, Latin America has about 100 financial development finance institutes, and both the sub-regional development banks and the national development finance institutes are very important in promoting growth, promoting infrastructure, developing the financial sector, and also fostering financial inclusion. And here at ECLAC, what we sustain basically is that financial innovation does not have to be a bad word, that you can use financial innovation for inclusion, for development, but the way one thinks about financing innovations has to change. One should view a financial innovation as a public good, not a private good. The fifth message that I would like to... Next one.
Jump on right.
The fifth message that I would like to share with you is the importance that has been pointed out, I think, in this panel, in the panel before, of private resources for development, but also the challenges about how to regulate and how to bring on board private financing so that private financing can be oriented for development, and how we need a very strong state and very strong regulations and risk regulations for that to happen. The fifth, or the before last point that I would like to share with you is that we believe in ECLAC that in the same way that you have to understand that the financial landscape has changed, that instruments have changed since Monterey, sources for financing have changed, the forms of cooperation have also changed. And I've heard in the last, in this conference, a lot of ODA, which is a certain form of cooperation. In ECLAC, we're trying to promote South-to-South cooperation, or and triangular cooperation, which we believe is essential for growth. South-to-South cooperation is generally a cooperation among equals. It's not donor beneficiary cooperation. It's not so vertical as ODA. It's more a horizontal cooperation. It doesn't focus so much on poverty. It focuses on infrastructure and on growth, and also on sharing technical knowledge. And for that reason, we believe that it's an important pillar that has to be included in a financing for development document. And the last point I wanted to make is the point that was made by the last speaker about the need or the recognition that although national policies are very important to promote financing for development, in the same way that one needs international multilateral cooperation to tackle and overcome the limitations to raise domestic resources, national policies by themselves are not enough to have a financing for development architecture that really promotes sustainable development. You need an enabling external environment, and the enabling external environment means that we must tackle the asymmetries that exist in the international financial architecture and also in the trade system. And here I'm just going to finish with the asymmetries in the international financial architecture. First, the international financial architecture in terms of voting power, in terms of quota, and in terms of voting rights does not represent the political power and the economic power of emerging market economies. According to the IMF, the emerging markets and developing countries weight in global GDP equals to that of developing countries, but developing countries only hold 38% of the international fund quotas and 40% of the World Bank's voting rights. So there has to be a proportionality between economic power and governance at the level of the multilateral institutions. Second, I think, and that was also mentioned by the last speaker, the international financial system has not been able to deliver stability as a global public good. In order to illustrate, as the financial assets, for example, between 1990 and 2007 or 2008 increased from 90 to 225 trillion. GDP increased from 20 to 60 trillion during that time, and most of the increase from 90 to 225 trillion of financial assets was within the financial system itself. It did not go to the real sector. And today we're seeing again in the instability of the financial system in terms of commodities. And in terms of extractive industries, what we've seen in Latin America is that obviously extractive industries have their problems. You can't have an exporting structure only based on commodities, but there is an extra issue that must be taken into account, and that's what happens when actually you base your development strategy or your productive strategy on an extractive industry, and the extractive industry becomes a financial asset. And so the instability that you can get in the rest of the economy, in your fiscal accounts, in your current account balance is very high. And finally, so that has to be corrected for. And finally, another feature that should be included in the Financing for Development document is the need to bring in regional financial institutions into the multilateral financial architecture. Regional, for example, development funds. We have the experience of one fund, the Latin America Development Fund in Latin America, which acts very differently than the IMF. It does not require conditionality. It helps some of the smaller or middle income or middle-sized economies in order to face balance of payments crisis or shortages of liquidity. And this type of institution can be a second line of defense when to confront the volatility of international markets or when countries have to face the effects of international crisis. Thank you very much.
All right, now it's over to you. So you can either ask questions to the panel, but remember, I'm glad to see a lot of hands, because we also have to answer the question, was this the most important agenda? Are there any important issues that we have overlooked? How can we be truly transformational? And where should CSOs put their campaigning resources? So that's the challenge. I see my dear colleague Jeroen on the back row, I think. Christian, you have the microphone. You're welcome. This is seriously scary. Okay, good.
Hello.
We have a microphone here as well. We have one here. Can we try and take that one? All right.
That's okay, great, fantastic.
Come here. We have.
No, I think this is sorted out, but there's a huge echo. Thank you very much. My name is Jeroen Qualkenbos. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at Eurodad, working on the ODA workstream. Thank you very much for your presentations. And I actually wanted to highlight something about ODA specifically, because it's something that comes up quite often within the European context of what the donors are willing or not willing to do. And in the context of FFD, I think we need to be very, very clear that recommitting to existing commitments is not a success. That is the bare minimum of what we should expect, that donors should take seriously what they already said that they were going to take seriously and then didn't. Because if you look at how the effectiveness agenda, even if we reach 0.7%, even if we meet all the quality commitments, the external factors still limit significantly how partner countries can and cannot use ODA. I'll give you a specific example. So we work a lot on promoting local procurement and using government policy to promote domestic investment in local firms. And even if you had all the quality commitments in place, aid was fully untied, you had everyone reach 0.7%. If you are in a bilateral trade agreement with Europe, you cannot use local content requirements on any of your procurement proposals. So, I mean, you know, the limitations are not in ODA, the limitations are outside ODA. So I think that from a bare minimum, we cannot come out of Addis, and if the donors say we've recommitted to the old commitments, and say that is a success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. I admire you for still having the bravery to ask for the microphone. We have a question in the back, and my apologies for those who don't believe in these policies, but I will give special preference to women. We have had a lot of men on the speakers list, so let this be a warm encouragement to the girls to speak up. It doesn't mean I don't want to hear from the guys, but...
Let's see. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I think so. A little bit echoey. I'm Beck from CAFOD in the UK, part of the CIDSI European Network and the Caritas International Network. I had a question that probably is a little bit for Esteban, but it's for everybody in the room as well, in terms of financial innovation. And I've been working on public-private partnership issues. And one of the things that's coming up, particularly around the specific issue of energy access, is the need for financial innovation. We seem to be given quite a fait accompli with one global model that's been bandied around. But there are where things work for poverty reduction on the ground, particularly for delivering energy access to people who live in poverty. We have not seen this model work, and we have seen other models work, which are very much focused at small networks and scaling up the networks and scaling up the process of allowing participation on a local level, getting lots of SMEs involved, including northern SMEs and southern ones, to do much smaller scale interventions. But I'm wondering, as a question to Esteban, what experience you have from Latin America about other innovations and what other solutions can be proposed in these upcoming major opportunities this year as alternatives to this one-size-fits-all approach.
Great, and you can hand the microphone to Grégoire right in front.
Hello.
Yes, yeah. That's good.
Until now. Yes, Grégoire from Caritas France. We expect for a transformative agenda, and we expect, as you said, to change the political reality. In 2008 and 2009, we had major opportunities for this, and we lose the ideological battle. We should have been the king of the world at this time, as civil society organization, progressist political parties and all that. And all these ideas we had about financialization, about trade, about tax evasion, we made some progress. But on the other aspects, now to deal with the problem is private sector, let's put some more private sector. The problem is financialization, let's put some more financialization in the system, in development, in climate, in the social matters. So if we want to be transformative now, we should also learn from our mistakes or our defeats a few years ago. And how do you explain, all the panelists, that our agenda has not been taken into account in 2008 and 2009 in Doha, in the conference on the world crisis and all that.
Great. I have right on the other side, Matthew Matson, and then I have Aldo and Katrina Liu.
Maybe I should do it without a microphone, just to avoid the risk.
No, it's safe. It's safe.
Okay, I'll keep it as far away as possible. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Or maybe nowhere.
That's good.
I wanted a couple of things. I mean, essentially, I agree with everything that all the panelists said, and thank you for 3 really inspiring big picture presentations. But I wanted to say, I think, and I've had this conversation with Romilly bilaterally, that I think the ODI work, while great, is underestimating the scale of the issue. The latest numbers coming out of Jeff Sachs and SDSN in New York are showing that actually it's 3 trillion we're talking about, of which 1.5 trillion should be public finance, if you take into account some of the stuff that people have been saying about which sectors can and can't be funded by private finance. And the other really worrying thing, to link up with what Martin said, is if we actually were to fund all of this privately, we would end up with the massive debt crisis. So I was sitting in a panel in World Bank last October saying, how should we pay for the SDGs? Where essentially the message was, yes, we know we have to spend twice as much, but we're going to do it all privately. And a Minister of Finance from Africa who was sitting next to me and who I've been advising since then was basically looked at me and said, okay, so we either have to drop half the SDGs or we have to go bankrupt because we're trying to fund them privately. From that has come what I think is a really exciting initiative, which is mainly why I stood up. So that Minister of Finance from Senegal and 26 colleagues of his, and this has now become a 60 government initiative, have formed something called the Coalition for Public Finance for the SDGs. Essentially to correct this messaging which you hear in Washington, but also in New York, which is we can do this all through the private sector. And they have there are various other people who've been very involved in this, notably Oxfam, notably UNDP, and it's now got several donor governments involved, several BRICS involved, essentially with an agenda on saying, first of all, we must get our governments to go to Addis at the highest possible level. That didn't happen in Doha, people just ignored it. So we should be asking preferably for prime ministers, but at the very least for finance as well as development ministers. The second thing is to make sure that the agenda is as much as possible dominated by talking about public finance and not about financial innovation and PPPs and so on. And the third is some really strong asks on doubling tax revenues, doubling development cooperation flows, setting standards for private sector flows, and pushing for innovative financing. I think there's a lot more detail than that, but I think for me the biggest thing that we need to be pushing on is the tax side, because Already, developing countries are funding about 3/4 of their current MDG spending. We've just done a report in DFI, Government Spending Watch report, that shows that it's about 77% that they're paying for out of their own tax revenues at the moment. So if we really want to give them a chance to reach the SDGs, then we have to campaign for tax justice. And as people on the panel said, that's not just about them doing more, it's about us changing the global tax rules so that they can do more. So for me, that's the biggest win that we could get out of this. We could actually get some serious change in global tax rules, preferably also institutions, but definitely rules. And one thing I was surprised didn't come up more in the opening session. Denmark made a wonderful initiative together with Sweden and Poland, and I'm going to forget the fourth country now. I can't remember the fourth country. There were 4 countries in the EU. Basically wrote to the EU Commissioner saying, we are prepared to stop asking for tax exemptions on our aid, except for humanitarian aid, which immediately increases the tax revenues in the countries, gives more ownership of everything in the countries. I think we should all be really supporting that initiative. When they told the Senegalese finance minister that in a meeting in Washington recently, he was absolutely overjoyed and said, you know, the biggest problem we face is most OECD governments coming and not just asking us for exemptions for their companies, but blackmailing us with threats of withdrawing aid if we don't give tax exemptions to their companies. So if we could actually get more governments to be like Denmark and to be saying, we won't insist on tax exemptions, we'll get our development financing institutions to refuse to ask for tax exemptions, and we'll get our companies to sign up to principles of paying fair tax, that would make a huge difference. Sorry to go on so long.
Good. Then let's give the microphone to Aldo and then Mark, so you don't have to run so far, Christian. And then we go to Katrina Lee, and if there are other questions, let me know, because otherwise we're going to go back to the panels, finish off, and then drinks. Aldo.
Yeah, so I think in terms of answering the 3 questions that you posed, I think there is a big issue that haven't heard mentioned so far, and I think it is an answer to those 3 questions, follow-up process for financing for development, making sure that we can preserve a robust, autonomous track for the financing for development conference. I think, and I know many of us here agree with me, that one of the big failures of financing for development was not to have an intergovernmental body that would periodically go back and look at implementation of the financing for development commitments. And we see now some not so subtle attempts by many governments to basically terminate financing for development by calling for what the northern governments are calling an integrated follow-up process. So an integrated follow-up process basically means financing for development would be followed up together with all the SDGs agenda by a body that has recently been created that nobody has ever seen functioning yet, which is called the High-Level Political Forum. So this is a body that meets 9 days. I think it's 9 days in the year. And, you know, nobody seriously can think that the discussion of financing for development can happen in some place, you know, they are in one of those 9 days, you know. So that's why I say it is not so subtle that this is an attempt really to end the discussion of financing for development, with the bonus for the countries that are pursuing this, the bonus that they think that by doing this, they also don't need to have ever again a financing for development conference. And this is not being voiced openly in the negotiation, but it has been voiced privately to some of us that once that there is such an integrated follow-up process, there is also no need for a paragraph like you have now in the zero draft, paragraph 124, calling for another conference in a number of years, which is still undefined, but still call for another conference. There wouldn't be a need for that either. So I would like to hear a reaction from the panelists to that issue. Thank you.
Great. Mark?
So, yeah, it's me again, sorry. You asked about the missing issues. I know we're development organizations, but so far we haven't talked about environmental aspects. And I think they're important not only for the future, but also for the whole discussion on financing for development. The SDGs will include environmental goals that have not much to do with social development. But since all the goals are part of this agenda, of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, they will be financed by ODA. And how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis environmental organizations? We're asking for actually a larger allocation of ODA to environmental issues and not social development issues. In what ways do we interact with these? Because it's different from climate finance. There are environmental issues that have nothing to do with climate finance. And a related question that maybe Martin can talk about is, if we're serious about the environmental agenda that we have in mind, even though we're development organizations, a lot of developing countries who are dependent on resource exports, gold, oil, whatever minerals, if we're serious about the agenda, they will sit on tons and tons of unused oil, unused gold, unused lead, whatever. And I think in their long-term agendas, they're still counting on being able to use all those resources for development. If we're serious about the agenda, they can't. How do we compensate developing countries for not using the mineral resources they have if we're changing sort of the system that we're having right now?
Thank you, Mark. And then Katrina Lee, and then Bodo. And we have 2 more questions in the back. Okay, it's your choice because we're delaying the drinks. That's what's happening. So your interventions will also become increasingly unpopular. But I think we should take a few more questions.
Thanks. Catherine Ollier from Oxfam, based in our European Union office in Brussels. Thanks very much for the 3 presentations and great recap of all the things we should be working on or working more on. But I had a bit of a similar question to Mark about the issue of environment and climate. So I'm not going to repeat what he said, but something we haven't talked about as well is trade. And this is something when I talk to my colleagues in African countries, for example, is quite important for them as well. So it's just interesting to hear about trade because it's officially part of the FFT. But my question actually was more about building on what you said, Esteban, about the new forms of cooperation, and the fact it's changed now; it's less vertical. And I want to play a bit devil's advocate here to build on the question about what's next after Addis. We're all gearing up to Addis, and hopefully it's going to be great, and we're going to get a lot of things we want to, but my question is, especially for Martin and Esteban, what's the best way to implement our great Addis outcomes? Is that really through the multilateral system, especially the UN, or should we push more for regional initiatives that could sometimes probably be more successful?
Thank you. And then another very, very dear colleague, Bodo.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bodo from Euredat, and I want to quickly make 2 comments on lessons learned from many years of financing for development campaigning and Euredat's work on it especially, and also pose 1 question. First of all, on the lessons learned, and thank you, Romilly, for flagging that we worked since 2001 on the fair and transparent arbitration procedure. Actually, our campaign at this time was not ineffective. 2001 was the last UDA conference before the first UN conference on financing for development before Monterrey, and we actually managed to make sure that in Monterrey there was the political agreement to create a debt workout mechanism. The problem is then that for the next 13 years nothing really happened, and this is before everyone goes to the workshops tomorrow. I want to raise attention to the fact that, and actually the lady from UNDP said it explicitly, the outcome of Addis will not be legally binding. So it is not enough to think about good language we see in the text. It's when we think about the agreements we want, we have to think about the implementation process that needs to follow. And several people actually reflect this, because otherwise a lesson learned from previous FFD rounds campaigning is certainly that there was a big hype of NGO campaigning in the run-up to the summit, but not much pressure after the summit to implement. So this time we really need to keep the pressure when the summit is over. Second lesson learned on the debt workout mechanism. Finally, 13 years after the agreement in Monterrey, we finally are closer than ever before to this mechanism, because we now finally have a United Nations process, and Martin flagged this in his presentation, an ad hoc committee at the United Nations. This is an initiative, and we should be very grateful to our Latin American partner countries. This is an initiative that comes from the South, it comes from Latin America, and this in a time when Europe would need such a mechanism first, because the debt crisis at the moment in Europe, and the next big debt restructuring will be most likely in Greece. So we have a situation now where international financial architecture reforms are mainly driven by the South, while Europe remains passive or is even boycotting such processes. And in my view, this changes also the character of CSO campaigning in Europe, because at the moment it's very much for us to make sure that Europe is not boycotting reforms that the South is taking forward. It's not so much about making our government champion things. Yeah, this is the second lesson learned. We have to basically reflect on what this means for the way we operate. The third is simply a simple question. The UNCTAD has last week released a proposal on how such a debt work mechanism may look like. This is the most comprehensive UN proposal ever in this regard. I'm not sure if you, friends of the panel, had already the time to look at it. It has been released just last week. Just want to ask what you think about this, if this is a good way. Thanks.
Great. So one last question to Hannah, and for the rest of you, I have the very comforting news that we will be here the whole week. So we hope to hear your questions tomorrow. I'm sorry, but people are starting to look very thirsty. Hannah, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah from Action Aid Denmark, and I shall be very brief. As Kirsten just pointed out, this is not my usual style to postpone drinks. And my comment was very much along the lines of Catherine's. I'd like to go back to tax. I think we should campaign on tax. I think it's one of the ways that we can fill in the gap. And I was wondering also, as you started out saying, maybe focusing strongly on an intergovernmental body on tax, maybe it isn't, I don't know, maybe it's not what we should be campaigning for if so many of them already, many of the governments that we were hoping would push for it are not pushing for it. What's our alternative? What's our plan B going to be? Or I'm not quite sure where that should go. And maybe it is something regional. Maybe regional suggestions or bodies are a better solution than a global one for the moment. Although, of course, I think it should be a global one, having global rules set in global settings. But yeah, so it was mainly a comment. Thanks.
Great. And back to the panel. So let's start with Romilly first.
So ladies first, and I'll try and be quick. 4 points. First of all, Jerome's question, I think it was at the beginning, about, is it worth looking at ODA when the wider structures are not there? I mean, I think it's both and I have to say, I do think with Addis, ODA is incredibly important also politically. Developing countries are not going to take the whole SDG agenda seriously if they don't see money on the table from the rich world. And that's unfortunate, because actually the rich world is not looking very generous at this moment. But I do think it's important substantively, but I think it's really critical politically. So I think it has to be both and, not either or. There's a point about sort of public finance related a bit to Matthew's question. And the one thing I forgot to say in my presentation is that people tend to equate public finance with ODA. And I think that's a mistake, because there's a lot of public finance that's not ODA. There's South-South cooperation, as I think you mentioned. There's also a lot of less concessional international public finance from the MDBs that's sloshing around the system. So I think let's kind of not forget that actually there's a huge amount of resources that need to be leveraged in a better way from the public sector. Related to that, this maybe is more to continue in the tea break or the beer break, but it's interesting, some of the research we've been doing at country level is suggesting that countries are going to the private capital markets to borrow because they don't want to take money from the traditional MDBs, because they don't like conditionality and all the things that we know about. But it means that they're borrowing at a much higher rates of interest normally from Eurobond markets and so on, and B, they're much more subject to some of these risks, foreign exchange risks and so on, which at least with the multilaterals there's a chance to renegotiate and so on. So I think, these, just to give an example of how integrated these issues are, that we're seeing that in a lot of countries at country level. Finally, Matthew, in terms of the cost, the issue around the costings being underestimated, we've only costed it for 3 sectors: for cash transfers, which is a sort of subsection of social protection, for health and education. The wider costs are much higher, obviously, and different people have done different costings. I do think the SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network costings, are quite interesting, because Because I think, as Matthew pointed out, when they look sector by sector, it's about half public, half private, maybe slightly less public than private, but it's pretty much, you know, almost equal. And the way that people talk, you would assume it's like 80% private, 20% public. So I think that's just, you know, I know our costs are low because they're just for those sectors, but I think even if you aggregate it up, you get a fairly consistent message about the importance of public finance.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions, so I'm just going to answer a few. The issue of financial innovation, we've tried to, what we've done with financial innovation, I talked about financial innovation in the context of regional and national development banks. And what we have, the way we view financial innovation is trying to take financial innovation from the private sphere and put it in the public sphere. And we see it in terms of financial processes, financial institutions, and financial instruments. And we've analyzed some cases for the productive sector in terms of financial innovation, and in particular, how can small and medium-sized firms, which create the bulk of employment in Latin America, how can they benefit from financial innovation? And I'm going to just give you two examples in terms of processes. For example, what we've seen is that some development banks, when they give a loan, and in order to have some type of backup for a loan, instead of having the typical credit scoring process, they go to the field, for example, where the person has the business, and they evaluate the business, and they evaluate the environment, and they evaluate the relationships of that person with other people. And that's a way where they come up with a better way to judge the payment capacity of the SME. That's one, and that's been done, I think, in Chile and in Colombia. There are cases, and maybe some other cases. In terms of instruments, what I'm thinking about is the issue of what you call venture capital, which in Latin America, apparently Latin America accounts for about 1% of world venture capital. But the venture capital that goes to Latin America is not really venture capital, because it's capital that, or finance that goes to projects that are already growing or in the process of consolidation, but they never go to where it is most needed, which is at the time when someone comes up with an idea or with a project. So what we've tried to do is to try to create or try to view the life cycle, for example, of a product or a process or a production projects, and try to identify instruments for each part of the productive cycle. And in Costa Rica, there was a project that ECLAC participated in. It's a governmental project to raise seed capital where the entrepreneur needs the most, where he makes it or he just doesn't make it. And those are two cases of using financial innovation at the public level, not to have a profit. And the idea of, when I talk of financial innovation as a public good, I'm talking about financial innovation as a public good in the broader sense of like education and health. Like you cannot be that where excludability is not desirable nor practicable in health, in education, and also in financial innovation. That's the way we are trying to see financial innovation. Regarding the question on trade, we touch upon the trade issue. I had one slide, but I didn't want to show it on trade. What we are worried in terms of trade are the mega regional trading agreements, about the big blocks and how developing countries are not fitting in. So when you talk, for example, about Monterrey, about leveling the playing field, this is how developing economies can integrate into these mega, or how do you regulate these mega regional agreements, which in the case of Latin America, they account for about 70% of their trade. So that's an issue to be worried about. Whether we have to push for UN or regional institutions, I think we have to push for some UN bodies like the debt restructure mechanism, like the body that was proposed by the Stiglitz Commission on regulating finance, like the multilateral tax cooperation body. But we also have to use the regional strength and regional institutional strength that regions have in order to build certain institutions, like at the level of finance and at the level of trade and at the level also of payment mechanisms. I think those three things are very important. That's what we see at ECLA. On the question of and this I finish on the question of commodities and the question of finance. Why do people not learn about financialization? There are several answers to it. I can think of, for example, the case of commodities. And why do they not learn about financialization? I think in the case of commodities, because there was partly, I think, because there was some intellectual justification in a paper that was written in 2004, whether it was proved empirically through a time series from 1952 to about 2002, that commodities, the rate of return on commodities was about the same as the rate of return on equity, and that they had lower volatility, and therefore go and invest on commodities. Now, today, I think we're learning a little bit more. There's a Bank of International Settlements paper that just came out in 2015, and the title is Oil and Debt, because a lot of oil companies, in the same way like investment banks, they leverage, let's say, on the mortgage. These companies, they leveraged on the price of commodities, and they're in debt. And so are a lot of governments. So the whole issue of commodities is an important issue. I stop right. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And lastly, Martin?
So many questions. I think probably we'll have to answer many of them at the workshop. I think there's a healthy feeling that ODA is very important. In fact, it is very important for all the reasons we know, not only humanitarian disasters, we need ODA for environment, we need ODA for social protection. So my worry is that when some developed countries are not able to continue their ODA at the same rate, you know, some countries have reduced and so on, and they don't want to be blamed for that, so they just shun the thing to either South-South cooperation or to private sector. The private sector is the worst, because if we don't do it properly, then it's going to cause more problems. So I think the community here, we have to reassert the importance of ODA politically, but also practically. And I think the kind of studies that have been done by ODI and many of you are going to be very important. But I want to point out something as well. When many things are now given to LDCs, not only ODA, well, we said the ODA has dropped, but then many countries are saying, well, we only give the ODA to LDCs, but also trade preferences and so on. We need to realize that 75% of the world's poor people live in middle-income developing countries. So these are huge countries. So if you go to the WHO today, they have a huge poster at the entrance that 75% of the poorest people in the world are in middle-income countries, and we should not neglect them as well. Mainly because there is a trend for funds like the Global Fund, or for companies that are trying to give, cheaper medicines only to LDCs. And then we are actually penalizing poor people in middle-income countries. I gave you the example of hepatitis C. So we have to keep that in mind very carefully. In relation to the question, why did we not become so powerful when our theories were right through the financial crisis and we let that opportunity slip? Of course, it's not only the NGOs who let it slip. Many political parties were caught by, they could not respond. And the empire struck back and gave you the solution, which is more of the same medicine. I think this is a very deep question. What is it we can do to take advantage of the next crisis when it comes? And I think in the workshop, we should discuss it. Of course, we have had victories as well. I think tax justice is a major victory. The highlighting of the investment treaties and how bad they are have emerged, not only because some developing countries have taken it up and championed it, like South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and so on, but also the European NGOs came out with very good studies and have become a force to be reckoned with, driving European parliamentarians into this issue and threatening the very existence of TTIP. So this is a major force that the NGOs have been very much part of, as well as, of course, the whole issue of intellectual property right, access to medicines and so on. There's a huge NGO community behind that. So how can we take on also the systemic issues in relation to finance? Maybe technically a little bit more difficult, that's why we are not able to, but maybe we should form a working group on systemic issues that can deal even with the sophisticated issues. As you know, the derivatives and so on. Tomorrow, I think there's going to be a session on it, and Miriam was talking to me about it. There are very few among the NGOs who look at the systemic issues. Of course, ALDO has been doing it too, but if we can do it from understanding and coming out with statements into something that can be a political force, then when the next crisis comes, and believe me, there will be a next crisis and it will be worse than the next one, we should be prepared for that. The whole issue of tax. So the UN actually at the moment has a UN expert committee on tax. These are experts. We are proposing that that experts committee be upgraded into an intergovernmental committee where governments can sit, discuss, and make decisions on international norms, on international regulation in relation to tax matters, rather than leaving it to the G20 or to a few developed countries like the G7, and then they decide for everyone. So this is a fight that is now going on in the FFD process. And I think those of you who are very concerned about tax, let the UN set up a UN governmental committee on tax matters, and then with NGOs able to come in and also give their suggestions and interact. I think this would be a positive achievement. But this, of course, is being resisted by some of the developed countries. ALDO raised a very important issue, and others also, on implementation. What happens after the FFD? And I think we fight so much on issues, but we don't pay enough attention on the institutional follow-up after that, and to make sure that there is institutional follow-up. And I think a lot of our energy should now go into that. Otherwise, we face an irony in which we may even get a very good declaration as we got in 2009. We had a UN conference on the financial crisis. It was a very good declaration. The follow-up was an ad hoc working group to follow up on that, and it was killed by the developed countries because they converted the working group into a series of panel discussions rather than an intergovernmental discussion on the 15 key issues that they were supposed to follow up on. So they killed it that way. But the developing countries were also to blame. They were not committed enough to insist. If they were committed enough to insist, then the other side would have to give way somewhat. So we don't want this to be repeated in the FFD. Now, the Rio +20 was even worse. It was a good declaration. They created a high-level political forum. They killed the Commission on Sustainable Development on the grounds that it was weak, so they wanted to replace it with something stronger. So what we had was killed the something that they came forward with that was stronger, because on paper it was stronger. If you read the terms of reference, it's very strong. But then they said it will meet 9 days in a year, and actually we don't know what it's supposed to do, exactly what Aldo is saying. And now they are saying that the FFD, you see, you have a secretariat in the FFD. There is a process. It meets once every 2 years. They may say, let's kill that one and put it into the high-level political forum because it's more powerful. And then it's not more powerful. So the little thing that you have is killed so that you can join a bigger thing that doesn't exist. So the irony is that actually the Rio +20 became weaker if as if they did not have the Rio, it would have been stronger. So let us look at this matter, those of you who are following in the UN and so on. Otherwise, FFD3 will be a victory in theory and in declaration, and then it will die because there is no follow-up. I think the major issue is that many developed countries do not respect the United Nations in the economic and social area. They prefer it to be done by the World Bank and IMF or by the G20. And anything that says give the UN something to do, they try to kill it. If they cannot kill it, they will try to kill it at the implementation stage. So this is something you can discuss at the workshop. Now, the issue of the missing issues and the environment. And the question is raised that, you know, if we use all the oil that we have in the ground, then the world is doomed. But if you tell countries that have just discovered oil, many countries in Africa have just discovered oil or natural gas. Now we are telling them, my brother, you know, for the good of humanity, please don't use the oil, please use solar energy. And my brother, it costs 8 times more expensive, who's going to fund for me? My brother, please, if you don't use the oil, you know, you will be contributing to humanity. And unfortunately, you have 8 agencies that go to the LDCs and put these messages to them, that they actually carry the burden. You know, I was at an IPCC meeting that approved the final IPCC, and one delegate raised the issue. He said, it's very strange. I saw this policy recommendation from IPCC on transportation. If you're a developed country and you have 3 cars per family, please switch to electric motorcar. If you're a middle-income country and you are beginning to have motorcars, please use public transportation, the bus and trains. If you're an LDC and you haven't started into motorized, please use a bicycle or walk. So the delegate said, look, I don't mind if you say those who have 3 cars, please give up the motor car and go for public transport, and all of us cooperate this way. But you are having apartheid in transportation without even realizing it. So I think the solution to the environmental crisis, particularly climate change, is that we must have equity at the heart of the solution. If the equity factor is not there, we will have no solution, and the world is doomed. So this is a very big issue. We also have climate financing, especially where we are talking about now on FFD. Lydie is here. She's been following it very closely, and this is at the very heart of the climate solution. Will there be financing? Is somebody going to pay the difference between solar energy that is more expensive, at least for the moment, and oil that is cheaper? And worse, if the country has discovered oil, what is the country to do? Will the country agree to leave the oil in the ground as Ecuador proposed? I will leave the oil in the ground. If you pay half of the revenue that I will lose, I will bear the other half. And there were no takers. So Ecuador is now drilling in the park. And can we blame Ecuador? Yes, we blame Ecuador, but can we really blame Ecuador? I don't think we can really blame Ecuador. On UNCTAD, I think that proposal by UNCTAD, the roadmap on external debt restructuring, is very good. So that is something to be supported. What I've heard is some major countries say that they don't want to hear anything about UNCTAD and external debt. I don't mind if it's brought up in the IMF or G20, in which case we will also shoot it down. But certainly if it's a United Nations agency, we don't want that. So a lot of campaigning has to be done to change that public opinion, so that that major country, you know which country we're talking about, today saying we don't want to hear about the UNCTAD principles or the UNCTAD roadmap on debt, will tomorrow say, oh, we want to hear about it. Why? Because our NGOs are so excited, and our provinces and state governments are so excited. And miracle of all, our Congress is so excited that the government has to follow. Now, that needs a lot of public education and campaigning. Finally, NGOs have a lot of expertise. I know because I'm following the Green Climate Fund. The governments in the Green Climate Fund from developing countries, they rely on the South Centre for a lot of inputs. The South Centre rely on the NGOs for a lot of inputs. The NGOs, including the Western NGOs, now directly give inputs to the board members from developing countries in the Green Climate Fund. So there is a lot of cooperation that can be done. We should maybe set up more systematic cooperation and mechanisms. We are saying the government should do it, yes, but if we do it and through us we are able to coordinate which governments can you influence, which governments can you influence. European NGOs can influence the European governments. South Centre and many third world NGOs can influence our developing country governments. And then we can bring a consensus among the governments, because in the NGO community and through institutions like the South Centre, we have got our act together, we have cooperated, we have harmonized, and then we get the governments to harmonize. In other words, the governments will do as we ask them to do. I think this is the role that we play, rather than the governments will miraculously do and we, the NGOs, will cheer them. And you know the dynamics. Huh? The dynamics is that if the NGOs don't champion a cause, very few governments will do it. Even if NGOs get into power and they become the government has to listen to the constituency, and the powerful constituency is business. So we have to have the countervailing duty where we are as powerful as business. And in many instances, we have shown that we are, and we have won. So now in the difficult area of finance and the systemic issues, we have to do the same. FFD is just an occasion that brings us together. Whether FFD succeeds or not is not really the key thing. In a way, it is a distraction from whether we succeed in getting our act together. But let us make use of it, because it brings us into dialogue with government. It focuses our minds. Governments will listen to us and we will listen to each other. So let us make use of it opportunistically. But what happens in FFD is not going to be the main determinant. What happens among us and how we cooperate with each other is the difficult thing. And that is what is going to determine it. So if this kind of conference that you are organizing in Eurodat, if we can have this once or twice a year, and we coordinate through working groups and mechanisms. You see, although you asked what will happen in the implementation of FFD, and I said, well, if we don't focus on the implementation, then it's going to be business as usual. Same with us as NGOs. How are we going to implement all the good things we are going to say? It's the difficult thing. But that's the expertise of the NGOs and the social movements. We can get our act together when we want to. Can we consciously try to do it through practical mechanisms and structures? Then we will actually succeed much more. And I think this is the challenge for us in the next 3 days.
Great.
That is what she should have said instead of me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I will remind you all to sign up for the workshops tomorrow, which includes many of the issues that have been mentioned now. Before I thank the panelists, just one comment on a word I don't want to hear, which is Plan B. We used to have a saying in climate change saying there's no planet B. So if what you mean by Plan B is to give up on our objectives before the fight has even started for real, I think we should come up with more and stronger Plan A's. So I wish you the best of luck for the workshops tomorrow. Warm thanks to the panelists, and let's get started on the real work.
Thank you. And you're going to tell us a story why you shifted from climate change into this, and maybe if you succeed in this, you will succeed in climate change, maybe.
You know what they did after Copenhagen? Well, I was